Hello and welcome to my last video of the year. In this video it's all about post-production and I'm going to be taking you through how to use the focus stacking and how to edit the images that we shot in the last video. For the most part we'll be editing our images in Photoshop, but I will also show you how to do the focus stacking technique in Digital Photo Professional, which is Canon's own raw editing software. This editing software is free if you buy a Canon camera, so it's already there for you and you don't have to spend any extra on software. So it's worth just showing you both. When it comes to raw editing, Digital Photo Professional is a global editor, so it's used for editing the entire image and not small sections of it. As a result, I often don't use Digital Photo Professional that much because in Photoshop I can use selective editing. However, if you want the very best out of your Canon RAW images, Digital Photo Professional does get a little bit more out of the RAWs than you'll get out of Adobe software. The other reason that you get better image quality out of DPP than you will out of Adobe software is down to the lens corrections. In Canon's software, the lens corrections are actually tested. So they test the combination between each lens in every camera. And then using that data, they're able to give you the best possible image quality and the best possible lens correction. Because no matter how perfect or how amazing a lens is, it's never completely perfect. So there's always a little bit of adjustment that can be done to bring it up to sort of even better. With Adobe software, the lens corrections are more of an estimation. And often they are pretty close and very good. But to give you the absolute optimum image quality, you are going to get better out of DPP. Before we even actually get started on the editing of the images, there's a few things we need to think about, particularly color management. So the hardware you're using does make a difference on this. I'm using a Dell ultra-sharp monitor which displays 100% of Adobe RGB. So what that means is of the colors that are capable of being captured by my camera, my screen can display all of those colors. If you're using a basic sort of monitor that came with your PC or your laptop monitor, often these monitors are not capable of producing the same number of colors as your camera could capture. So you get a bit of disparity between what the image was captured and how it looks on your screen, and then how it's viewed by other people will seem different to how it looks on your computer. You don't necessarily need a screen that can display 100% of Adobe RGB. sRGB will also be quite sufficient for most people's uses. So Adobe RGB and sRGB are color gamuts. They're an array of colors and information that the camera has captured and what your monitor can display. If your monitor can produce fewer colors than sRGB, what can happen is that your images look different on your computer as they do on any other screen. And that's going to happen anyway because not every screen is calibrated. However, you're not going to give your images the best starting point to be viewed online or displayed elsewhere. So that brings us on to calibration. Once you've got a monitor and you're happy that you're going to be using that monitor for all of your image editing, you definitely need to calibrate it. To calibrate, you need another piece of hardware. This one is the Datacolor Spider 4. There are other brands, X-Rite as well do some really good calibration units. I don't really have a recommendation. They're all probably quite good. What's nice about these, some of the better ones and the newer ones, is that they will take into account the ambient light of the room as well, so that you get a very accurate image on your screen. And what they do is you literally attach it to your monitor on the front of the monitor, and it takes a read and it runs through different colors and it takes a read off the screen as to what the color should look like and what it actually looks like, and then basically matches them up and then loads up a profile into your computer so that you have completely accurate colors. That also brings us on to color space that you should be using. When shooting RAW and in camera, you can choose to shoot in sRGB or Adobe RGB within the camera. It doesn't really matter which one you pick because you can always change when you bring it into Photoshop. The information is still there, even if you're shooting in sRGB and you want to switch over to the larger color space of Adobe RGB. However, for myself, I find the vast majority of my images are being viewed online, and the internet generally works on sRGB. So I'm editing my images in sRGB and then outputting them in sRGB. That way, the websites and the sort of web hosting or the web browser that people are using isn't guessing and sort of changing the colors every time it's rendered. Because if it's an Adobe RGB, it has to sort of guess and use its own algorithm to reduce that color space down to sRGB. And you don't get consistent results in doing that. So I just tend to shoot in sRGB and output in sRGB. If I'm shooting for print, then I'll use a bigger color space because it benefits from that. There are other color spaces as well, such as ProPhoto. However, for the most part, I just stick with Adobe RGB or sRGB, as I just find it a little bit easier, and particularly because the internet sort of works on sRGB. It's just not worth the extra effort of editing an image and then having to re-edit it slightly to make sure that it fits nicely as sRGB afterwards. So thinking about your output really determines the method of which you edit your images. The next thing is bit depth. So it's worth letting Photoshop know that you would like to be editing in 16-bit. And the particularly good reason for doing this is when you get sort of very similar colors, like a plain background behind a subject, and there's very small amount of tonal range, what can happen with 8-bit is you get slight lines in the image where it's sort of changing tone. With the 16-bit images, you get a much smoother gradation between similar tones. So I'll quickly show you how to do that. I'm here in Photo Mechanic, and I'll just open up an image to edit in Photoshop. And down the bottom here, we have this little line of text. That text doesn't give a lot away, but if you click that, that's your preferences for the processing of this image and then how to bring it into Photoshop. I've set it up to Adobe RGB here at the moment, but you could very easily stick it in sRGB or ProPhoto if you want an even bigger color space. And then you've got the bit depth on the right hand side. And hit OK, and then when you open that, you've opened it up as a 16-bit image. In terms of computer performance, there are lots of things you can do to sort of help your computer cope better with image editing, and the primary thing is to work off an SSD rather than a hard drive, so a solid state drive. This greatly increases the speed of your computer and particularly helps with image editing. Having more RAM, graphics processor and all the rest obviously helps too. I won't get into the hardware too much because that's a whole nother topic. The last bit of hardware is totally optional, but I find that it helps my editing massively, and that is one of these. That is a Wacom graphics tablet, and you interact with it with a pen, stylus, and it's a very natural way of interacting with your computer. And if you're editing images selectively on small sections of the image, you can paint on effects so that you're getting a much more accurate sort of selection of the area of which you're adding those effects to. I have found, particularly for portraiture, it has been completely invaluable. At first I found it very difficult. I borrowed one for a little while, absolutely hated it, sent it back to my mate, and then eventually it clicked and I realised I absolutely needed one, and now I cannot do the same level of editing with a mouse as I can with one of these. It's made a huge amount of difference. So that's a Wacom Intuos Pro I use, and it's totally optional, and certainly for wildlife photography it's not necessary in the sense that you're perhaps not doing as much painting on images as you would with other areas of photography. To start with, for the editing, I'm going to go with Digital Photo Professional, and we're going to edit some of the images we shot in the last video. I'm going to start with the focus stacking technique. So I'll use the images that we actually shot of the candle snuff fungus, and that was all set up on a tripod using the focus bracketing option in the EOS RP. All of these images are shot in RAW, and we're going to put them all together. So this is the file management part of Digital Photo Professional. I'm going to select the candle snuff fungus part of the images. So once we've selected the images, we're going to go up to Tools, Depth Compositing, and Tools, Depth Compositing, and Start Depth Compositing Tools. So we have a few different options to tweak the composite. We can tweak the amount of bokeh that the subject has. We can sort of tweak where the important part of the image is. So if it's closer to you, you want the this middle bit weighted towards nearer subject slightly higher, and then you can tweak the adjustment around smoothers of compositing boundary. I tend to leave it as the default, and we'll just see what happens. So we hit execute. Now that DPP has run through that process, I can select the resulting image, so that will be labeled DC and then the image name, and you'll notice that it's rendered it as a JPEG. What I can then do is select that image, go into Tools and Depth Compositing, and then Depth Compositing Editing tool, and that allows me to tweak that image. I'm quite happy with that as it is. I want as much of it in focus as possible, and I can then hit Save As and save it as a TIFF. And then I can go into the folder, find that TIFF, and there we are. I can then use that TIFF, I can edit that in Photoshop if I want, or I can continue to edit that within DPP as well. So if I want to do some sort of changes to the colours and whatever, I can do that to it too. So that's how you do it in DPP. Now I'll show you how to do it in Photoshop. To speed things up, I've created a folder with just the images that are going to be used in the stack, just to make things a bit quicker. We're going to hit File and go down to Scripts, and then Load Files into Stack. Browse, and I'm going to go to that folder, so Stack 2. I'm going to select all these images. I'm using JPEG for this just to speed things up a little bit. See, all of those images are listed there. What I can do is hit this button here to attempt to automatically align those images. And that's particularly important if you've done a handheld stack. If you use a tripod and the subject isn't moving at all, then you shouldn't need to use this at all. I have pretty shaky hands and I did all these handheld, so I'm going to check that box. Hit OK. And Photoshop is just going to load up all of those images into one file, because what we want is lots of images as layers. So Photoshop has loaded all of those images as layers within a single file, because that's what we want. We don't want to open loads of images separately, we want them all loaded onto them as layers. You see them all on the right hand side there. You can see there's gaps around the edges because I've handheld it, so it's sort of adjusted and rotated the images so that everything lines up nicely. That's fine, I'm not too worried about that. I'll crop it after to make sure that obviously they're not there. And then we just want to select all of the images. So we're going to hit the top one, hold the Shift button and hit the bottom one. And then we're going to go up to File, no we're not, we're going to go to Edit and Auto Blend Layers. Hit the Auto Blend and then we've got Stack Images just there. And I tend to leave Seamless Tones and Colors selected, but I'm not going to bother with Content Aware Fill Transparent Areas. All that does is obviously fill in those transparent bits around the edges where I've missed, where it's sort of missing information because it's aligned the layers. I'm just going to crop in, but if you want to try and let Photoshop fill that in, you can give it a go. You get mixed results doing that. Sometimes it's absolutely brilliant. I'm going to hit OK. And then we have it, it's done. We have all of the images loaded up into a stack, and you can see on the right hand side, all it's done is use layer masks. If you've seen my other video about post-production, you'll know about layer masks. So it's just turning on areas of images and turning off areas of other images, and you can see which ones it's using and where. It's quite simple. So you can see that's that section of that image, and it's just building it up like that, so that we have a completely in focus image. With more layers, you can obviously get more of the image in focus. I've just gone for the subject only, but if you want a little bit more context and you want the I think it's sort of hanging off a thistle on this one, if you want more of the thistle in focus, you could do that as well. And now all we have to do is crop it. So I'm going to select the crop tool, and I'm going to keep it at original ratio, and just bring those corners in a little bit. There we have it. Cool. Cute little snail. So that's how you do a stack, but how would you edit a single image? So I'm going to go back into Photo Mechanic, and I'm going to select a single image, and we'll go with this feather, it's quite pretty, and we'll hit edit. So that's going to bring it into Adobe Camera Raw. We have a raw image here. I'm just going to reset this. There we go. So I've reset that to how it would be when you open the image, and you'll notice the profiles up here on the right hand side. So we've got landscape, portrait, standard, vivid. I ignore that entirely. I don't particularly like these profiles. So my camera is generally set to faithful. That way, what I see on the back of the camera is likely to be very similar to what I get on the computer. Often you'll take a picture, look at the back of the camera, and it looks amazing, and then you bring it into your computer, run it in through Photoshop, and it looks a little bit flat and loses that punchiness that was on the back of the camera. And that's down to using a picture style. The camera shows you a rendered JPEG from the RAW, and it applies looks to that RAW based on the picture style that you've selected in the camera. You might not think you're using picture styles, but it will have one set by default. Now you can set that to neutral or faithful, and that will give you the closest to RAW on the back of the camera that you're going to see. But what happens when you bring the RAW file into the computer, into Adobe, is it disregards that information and just shows you a render of the RAW without the picture style look applied to it. So you get a very big disparity between what's on the computer screen and what's on the back of the camera. And the back of the camera often looks much better. And then you're sort of working to try and replicate that look again, and by increasing the contrast and the colors and whatever. If you bring it into Digital Photo Professional, it'll apply the same picture style, so you get exactly the same look on the DPP as you will on the back of the camera. Editing within Adobe Camera Raw gives you the greatest flexibility of sort of playing around with the image. If you open images and then go straight into Photoshop and then try and adjust the exposure and things, things will degrade much quicker. Likewise, if you're shooting JPEGs and you're bringing them into Photoshop, you're not going to have as much latitude to sort of correct for exposure than you would in RAW and using ACR. So within this section, we have an option to correct the white balance. If you've seen any of my other videos, you'll know I shoot in a set Kelvin value for white balance generally. I don't shoot in automatic. And the reason for that is I can then get consistent results, and even if it's consistently wrong, I can just make an adjustment on one and then copy that adjustment over to all of the other images, and they are so much quicker to edit them. On this image it's pretty close to correct, but we can tweak that by sliding these two sliders here. And you can also use this little ink dropper tool, so white balance tool. This is quite handy if you've got, particularly if you're using a grey card, so you can have a grey card in the image as in the first image to take a sort of sample from, and then you can click the ink dropper tool, select that grey card. You can also do it on things that should be white, so if there are things that you know should be white or on that grey scale, you can just click the ink dropper tool and select a part of the image. However, your eyes can be deceived quite easily in that looked white, but actually that particular pixel might have had elements of green in it or yellow or things. So when you do that, you're hoping that individual pixel is that colour. You can also select an area, so you can sort of select this area and it will do the same thing. But there's actually a lot more colour in there than you perhaps realise. So I tend to do it by eye. This can take a bit of playing around, getting used to. And my general recommendation is not to try and go for colours creatively by using the white balance bit. You want to just get a base correct level at this point, and then you can do the colour corrections and the colour sort of editing, colour toning a little bit later. You can correct for exposure and you can see how much detail there is. So certainly in the shadowy areas there's more detail there. If you want to, if you've over or underexposed, you've got a lot of sort of play there to get back some of the image. I want to leave that probably where it is, and you know, we can not that one. We can use the highlight slider to bring that down to make sure that we get some texture in the white area. I'll leave that a little bit lower, and then shadows I tend to, well, shadows, it's sort of, and how you go about this editing really depends on the image and the mood and tone that you want to go for as an end result. I tend to reduce the blacks a little bit, darken the blacks a little bit, and then increase the contrast a bit to make the image a little bit more punchy, because raws by their very nature tend to be a bit flat. They lack a little bit of contrast, so I try to push that back into an image. And then in an image like this where there's lots of texture, I would want to up that a little bit just to sort of increase that perceived sharpness of the image. And clarity a little bit. Clarity is one you want to be a little bit careful with, because it can very quickly look a bit fake. Like that, looks pretty horrendous. So I'm very careful with it. One thing I never do is anti-clarity, like the opposite direction. It just looks like you've got Vaseline on the lenses. It's very old-fashioned. I'm really not into it. I'm very against that. And texture as well, you know, reducing the texture in the image. Why would you do that? You've just spent all that money on a beautiful kit that gives you very sharp images, and then you're removing all the texture and detail. Makes no sense to me. So that's the sort of base bit of editing I would do. You can go in and do the lens corrections if you like. I don't tend to do lens corrections much. I pick the lenses I use based on the character of that lens, and I often quite like that. Particularly within portraiture. Nature stuff is slightly different. Landscape stuff is particularly different. Often you want to have that very correct and reduce the amount of distortion in wide images and things like that. But as I say, you'll get better results doing that through DPP. You can then adjust the exposure a little bit more using curves if you like, increase the sharpness within the detail panel here as well, and reduce reduce noise if you've got a noisy image. Again, this is something I rarely do, primarily because a little bit of noise doesn't bother me, and certainly in the newer Canon camera models, the noise sort of pattern is more grain rather than colour noise, and colour noise is very horrible, looks very digital, and that's what you would want to get rid of. But in the later, newer cameras, it tends to be more like grain, and it looks a little bit filmic, so I don't really mind it. So I might increase the colour noise reduction, but I rarely ever touch that noise reduction slider. Next bit is colour mixer. This is if I don't want to edit in Photoshop, in full Photoshop, I will do the colour grade and the colour toning in Lightroom. And we can do that by adjusting each of the colours individually. So there's a lot of yellows and greens in this image, so we can play around with that. And we can sort of adjust the tone of those. how far you want to go with this is, down to your personal preference. So that's the hue of those colours, and then we got the saturation tab as well. So obviously saturation, if you ramp that up, will look a little overbearing. And then we have luminance, so that's the brightness of those individual colours. So I can sort of make the yellows darker or brighter compared to the other colours in the image. And in the next bit we have split toning. So split toning is often what people use to create sort of Lightroom presets type thing. I very rarely use this, to be honest, but you can change the tone of the highlights and then change the tone of the shadows. So you get this kind of look. It's a little bit Instagram filter for me. So using the color mixer tool, you can create a bit of an autumn look to your images by sort of pulling the yellows and the greens over to more orange and yellows. It's really up to you how far you take this. I tend to prefer a little bit more of a yellowy, warmer look, so I tend to sort of just pull those yellows over just a touch towards the orange side of things. And that's pretty much it. You can, within Adobe Camera Raw, edit stuff much finer as well. So you can go into, on the right hand side you have these panels, so you can go in, you've got spot removal. So for example, there's this little slightly weird looking thing down here. I can select that and try and get rid of it, and it will sort of replicate another area of the image to hide that, so you can get rid of small distractions. Again, within nature photography, whether you should do that if you're doing competitions and things, I don't think that's allowed, so you should just check that. And then we have an adjustment brush. So if you, for example, if you wanted to adjust just the area of the feather, we can sort of click and select that area, just paint onto that, like so. And I can adjust that area individually, so I can increase the contrast, for example, or I might want to bring down the highlights a touch just on the feather. It's probably a little bit more processed than I would normally do this image, to be honest, but this is quite useful if you have sort of white balance shift. So if you've got some ambient light or color casts from a reflection of something, it's quite useful to be able to do this. Just selectively you change the colors or the tone of an area. It's also great if you've burnt out a little bit of an area, so it's too bright in an area. Similarly, exactly the same adjustments that you can do, but you have a graduated filter type thing. So if you're doing landscape photography, this is very useful. You can reduce the exposure in a part of the image. If you imagine a sunset, you can do that too. Same with the radial filter, it's just a round version of that. So that's how you locally adjust the images, so you do small sections of it. We can open the image up into Photoshop. You don't have to, you can actually save directly from that. There's a save button in the top right hand corner. And then within Photoshop, to be honest, that's all I would do to this image. So I'm going to take out, open up another image in Photoshop and show you on that how we can take things further. For this next image, we'll go for a slightly more complex shot. So in this image, I have a heron shot in London. I'm going to bring that into Adobe Camera Raw first. And you can see I've already applied quite a lot of a look to this. I'm just going to reset that to default. So that's how the image looks as raw. It's a little bit washed out. There's a bit of a lack of contrast in this image, so I'm going to just increase the contrast quite a bit. Not too much that it looks crazy, and then just drop the blacks down a little bit, and the highlights aren't too bad. And I'm just going to bring up the shadow, so this dark area on the right hand side here isn't too dark. In fact, what I'll do is I'll use a graduated filter for that, as we have, as I showed you how to do it. So I'll bring that over, and so the space between the red and the green part of the graduated filter is how much of a sort of fade you want between the two areas. Now I can just increase the exposure in that area so it's a little bit more even. And then I'll go back to the normal edit, and as you see it's still quite sort of grey and lacks a bit of contrast, and I can bring down the blacks again. So that way I can bring down the blacks further without this going into complete darkness. And if any of this was sort of overexposed, I might just reduce the exposure in those areas, but I think they're all right. I'm going to increase the texture a tiny bit and the clarity a touch, and just check it's all sharp. Yeah, it looks good. The white balance looks pretty good to me. I'm just going to open that up in Photoshop so I can show you how I would edit an image like this in Photoshop. Within Photoshop there's lots and lots of ways you can edit colour. There's too many to count, and certainly more than I know. There are a few quite common ways, but the key thing within Photoshop is that it is a destructive editor in a way that Adobe Camera Raw isn't. You can always go back in Adobe Camera Raw. So what I won't do is I don't edit on the base layer, this background layer. I'll always create a new layer to work on. Now you can either duplicate that layer and work on that, or you can just use adjustment layers. So there's these tabs here, these buttons here, which are adjustment layers. I am going to go for some color adjustments in this image. So I go with color balance. That's generally how I start my color work, as I use color balance. And I tend to start in the shadows and go for a sort of, pick my kind of tones I like, and then do the opposite sort of thing on the highlights. And a very gentle touch is needed here, because if you go too far it can very quickly look quite bizarre. Mid-tones I tend to be very gentle with. I don't touch the mid-tones much. And we can sort of create a little bit more contrast within different colours and a bit more mood in this. And we can go across to another one I like, is selective colour. So selective colour works quite similar to how editing colour does in Adobe Camera Raw, in that you select your individual colour range and you adjust that. So I can, oops, it's probably mostly yellows in this. Quite often what you think is green is actually a lot of yellows. And again, we can kind of create a bit of a slightly autumnal look. I know that's not correct for that type of tree, but you know, I like this sort of look. The black slider just increases the sort of saturation actually, ultimately. What we can also do is set up a dodge and burn layer. So if I want to selectively brighten or darken an area of the image, I might want to dodge and burn, which is a term from analog darkrooms. The reason I might want to do this is if my subject is in shadow like it is, I can brighten that up. Now there are dodge and burn options on the left hand side on these tools. I never use it. It sort of degrades the image a little bit too much. So what I do is I create a new layer, a new adjustment layer, so a curves layer, grab a curves layer, and I'll go sort of midway along the curve. I'll just click and hold that and I'll bring it up quite a bit, so it's a bit overexposed. There we are. And then on this bit, the layer mask, I'm going to make sure that bit is selected, not the layer, just that white box there. And I'm going to press Control I, so that turns it black. Now these are layer masks. I'm going to do one more, another curve, and I'm going to bring that one down to darken the image. And again, make sure that's selected and then press Control I. So that's inverting that white into black. And I'm just going to select both of these, put them into a folder and call it Touch and Burn. And the one that's higher or more exposed we're going to call Dodge. And the one that's darkening we're going to call Burn. And then all I do is I grab the paintbrush there and make that slightly bigger and use a white paintbrush, so we select the white. So a layer mask is the mask is just turning it off, and all we're doing is turning that layer on in certain areas. So we use the white to turn that layer mask white, which in turn turns it on in that area. So I've got it on 100%, so my opacity is 100% and flow is 100%, just to show you. I would never actually do this. And as we paint it on, it's showing through that burn layer. Right? And what's great about it is it's always reversible. No matter how many steps further down the line you get, and you say, oh, I actually don't want it so dark on that, you can just switch over to black and you can turn it off again. And you see this little layer mask is changing every time I make a change to the image. It's changing on the right hand side. And same with the Dodge, we can turn that on in certain areas so we can brighten him up. What I would actually do is have this on at about around 20%, and the flow down to 20% as well. And we just paint it on, and we do very subtle changes, and we can brighten up our subject. And we can use it to darken areas of the image. In fact, we'll go a little bit higher just to speed things up. And we might want to just darken the area that's directly behind the subject, just to create a little bit more separation between our subject and the background. One thing you do need to be careful of is not to get halos. So if you brighten up the subject here and you're using too soft a brush and too large a brush, you're going to end up with like an area around the subject that's really bright for no reason. So you need to be careful of that. I want to just brighten up this area maybe, whatever you want to do. So that's dodging and burning. Dodging and burning isn't something that is a new digital technique. It is something that was done in the darkroom, where you would use bits of paper and flags to sort of shadow or expose parts of the image more when enlarging your images. So depending on where you're outputting your image, you want to output from Photoshop in the correct settings for where it's going. So I might want to crop this image slightly differently, or I might want to leave some space for text if it's going to go on somewhere where it would have text. And then once the crop is done, I just want to size the image. So I'll hit image, image size, and within that I can set the image size for web, because most likely this is going to end up on the internet. So I'll set that for 2000 pixels. I tend to just leave it at about around 2000 pixels. Is fine for most things. And this bit where it says pixels per inch, it's not really relevant to web stuff. It's only really relevant to print. It's also not relevant if you're outputting at a specific pixel size. If you're doing this measurement in inches, then the resolution in pixels per inch makes sense. When you're doing it in actual number of pixels, it has no bearing at all. Then we just hit OK. That's ready to go. You may also want to apply a layer of sharpening. There's many ways of applying sharpening within Photoshop. My preferred way is to use unsharp mask. So what I'll do is I'll select the top layer and press Ctrl-Alt-Shift-E, and that's what's called a stamp visible layer. So that's Ctrl-Alt-Shift and E, or Command-Alt-Shift and E if you're on a Mac. So that layer is that top layer, so if I just remove all the other ones, is a flattened version of everything that's underneath it. So it's like a bookmark. You can just put that in, and that's a stage within your editing. So everything underneath that is applied, and then you get this sort of outputted image on the top. This is my preferred way of doing it. There are other ways. And then I go to sharpen, unsharp mask, and we can sharpen the image. And it's best to zoom in to 100% on your image, roughly, or quite zoomed in. Because otherwise you will over sharpen and you won't realise it because you can't see. How much sharpening you apply will greatly depend on the amount of small detail in the image, as well as how large the subject is in the frame. So I would probably go for a radius of 1 pixel. So the radius is how, if your subject is very large in the frame, you might want to go for a slightly larger radius, because then it will affect the larger features within the frame. But as this is quite a small subject in the frame, I'm going to stick to 1 pixel. And I don't tend to touch the threshold at all. I just leave it on 5. If I do that really high, you can see how much it degrades the image. And if you have a noisy image, what can happen is the sharpening process actually sharpens the noise, which makes it more prominent. So you want to be careful of that too. I think around that sort of region is perfectly fine for the subject. And then we have it. That's all you need to do. And then you just want to save it. So there are multiple ways you can do this. You can use export as, which is quite handy if you're putting stuff out for web. Choose the format as whatever your preferred format is, and then if it's in Adobe RGB, it will convert it to sRGB here, so that when you bring it onto the internet, it's already done as sRGB. I think I am in Adobe RGB from a previous. If you want a bit more control over your sharpening, within the Adobe Camera Raw sharpening area, within this detail tab, you can actually open up the sharpening bit in more detail by clicking that little down arrow. And then when sharpening, you can hold the Alt key and you can see a little bit more detail what's going on. Let's just zoom into this a little bit. So you see there's lots of detail in this image. And if I hold the Alt key while moving this radius slider, you can see how much it's going to impact the image. Likewise with the detail slider, we can see, it's probably very hard to see that on a stream now I think about it. Most importantly, within this little drop down is the masking area. If you hold the Alt key and drag the slider, you'll see that some of it turns black. And the black areas is where the sharpening is not going on, and we're turning it off in those areas. And that's useful where there's just sort of areas of not much information except noise, because we don't want to be sharpening the noise. And also the out of focus areas, we don't want to be sharpening those either, because it can create weird effects. We just want the sharpening to be happening where there is detail. So that masking is particularly useful. I tend to do a bit of sharpening at the beginning and then a little bit at the end for output as well, if it needs it. If you need to edit small sections of an image out, you can use the healing brush tool to remove sections of the image. So for example, if we want to get rid of the main subject for some strange reason, we can literally, let's just go for spot healing brush tool and select the subject. That's using content aware, and it just somehow actually does a pretty good job. Slightly blurriness in there, but that's the quickest way of removing subjects. But again, you're working on a base layer. So what I would tend to do is actually duplicate the background layer. If we didn't have that one, I would actually duplicate the background layer. Just hit that and duplicate layer. That way, if you make any mistakes, you've always got the background layer to go back on. You can also use the clone stamp if you want to get rid of smaller areas or do it a little bit more subtly. So say I wanted to just reduce these branches because they're a bit distracting. I can hold the Alt key and I'll be sampling from wherever I click. So I'll sample from there and then I just paint on above that. And it's very much worth using a low opacity and painting it on, and a smooth brush, so a soft brush. And make sure you're sampling the current layer on that right bit, otherwise it goes wrong like that. You can use a harder brush when you get close to the end, just to ensure it looks a little bit more realistic. And then I would blend in the areas that you've just done a little bit, because if there's repeating patterns, it makes it very obvious that you've just removed something. There we go. When you zoom out, you don't really know that anything was there. There's a bit of repeating pattern there, but a little bit more work and we can get rid of that. We also might want to get rid of this out of focus line here because it just sort of looks like it's coming from its beak. So we could, if we wanted to, get rid of that fairly simply. There we are. Another way of doing this would be with frequency separation. If you need to remove or manipulate areas within an image in a little bit more detail. Frequency separation is something that's commonly used in portraiture and beauty retouching, and it's not regularly used within nature photography. So I won't be covering that in this video, but if you want to have a look at my live stream on the Wex page, Facebook page a while back, I'll leave a link in the comments. I did cover it in that video so you can see it there. Another way of editing colors is using the curves adjustment. So I can go into hit the curves button, and quite often curves is just used for adjusting the exposure, but you can actually go into the specific colors and adjust the exposure of that color to create quite interesting color grades. That's a bit wacky, but gives you an idea of what can be done with curves. I tend to use the color balance first, that's my go-to, and then I adjust things like selective color, even hue and saturation. I go into the individual colors within that, and a little bit of curves. And then sometimes channel mixer, but I find channel mixer is very easy to mess up. You need to be very, very, very careful with it. With our snails, once you're happy with the focus stack, if you want to edit the image further, you can highlight all of those, right click and say flatten image. That will then give you a single background layer to work on. You see that it just creates a little bit more contrast and interest in the image, slightly more ethereal look to the colours. We can also just increase the contrast a little bit by just bringing that slider in on the curves, and then bringing that slider in under the highlights just to bring up the highlights. And I think that's all I would do to this image, and I just export it from there. So that's it. That's how I would edit nature photography. Obviously you can take it much further if you want to do some more image manipulation or composite type work. I don't tend to do that. I try and keep it fairly natural. The most I tend to do is some color work and a little bit of dodging and burning, and perhaps a little bit more in the exposure within Adobe Camera Raw. The vast majority of editing for most nature photography can be done in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom. In terms of whether to use Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, it's the same engine, it's the same platform that's being used. The editing is actually identical, it's just the file management system within Lightroom that's being used on top of that. it's entirely personal preference. Your actual image quality will not vary at all. I just prefer Adobe Camera Raw, and I don't really like Lightroom. It doesn't perform very well on my computer. As always, I will leave you with a slideshow of images from a few of the other videos while I can answer all of your questions in the live chat. So ask away. The next time you see me will be sometime next year. I hope you all have a very lovely Christmas. Thank you very, very much for watching. Goodbye.